becomes why. And how do I earn that? How do I earn the favor of God? What causes God to grant me that favor? On the other hand, what causes God to say that I'm a righteous individual as opposed to other people apparently not being righteous, because we were told that Adam was the only righteous one in his entire generation. There was nobody else there. We would have to assume, right? We would have to assume that humanity had laws in which God gave to them for them to live by. Mm-hmm. Based on the fact that God judged them, we would have to assume that they're in violation of these laws. Okay? So, probably what we want to do, at least in our next one, because this is probably getting a little bit lengthy by this time, is we would like to actually discuss just the idea of obtaining true and correct ideas of God. You know, if somebody walked up to you and said, for example, if somebody asked you, is God a just God?
I would say, yeah.
Yeah, we would say yes. Mm-hmm. But then would I have to ask you, why do you think that? Mm-hmm. And what makes you think He's a just God? You know, it's easy to say. It's almost like saying, for example, when people say, how many gods are there? Well, there's one. Right? One in numerical number. What does that idea of one mean when we talk about God? Right? Mm-hmm. So we have to explain that. And so when I ask somebody that, you know, do you believe that God is just? You know? And they'll say yes. My next question is, what makes you believe that? Mm-hmm. Right? What makes you have a belief that He is a just God? Right? Mm-hmm. We'll talk about that.
All right.
All right? So actually, if we really conceive really true and correct ideas of God, then we can actually go back to the Genesis text and we can identify points in time within these people's lives, the people that was living prior to the flood, that they violated certain laws that a just God gave them. Mm-hmm. And that it wasn't just an overnight thing that they decided just to rebel overnight. Mm-hmm. In other words, it seems like there was a slow breakdown of society. You know, it almost seems like nothing ever happens overnight. I mean, you know, you realize that, at least within, you know, a dictator just doesn't walk in one day and say, I'm going to become your dictator. Right. It's like a slow process. You know, he wins a certain amount of people over, and then either by strength or power, he wins the other people over, you know. Right. And then eventually he sets himself up as a dictator. So it's like nothing just really happens overnight. Right. So we have a deterioration of society in the book of Bereshit, the book of Genesis, to the point where God has to step in and say, okay, you guys have gone so far that I cannot allow humanity to continue to exist. Now, why does He do that? That's the real question, you know. Mm-hmm. Is He just in doing that? You know? And so, what do they violate? You know, we have these strange words in English. You know, actually, we'll start even back in the days of Enosh. Because, as you said, you know, some translations are pretty good, other translations are not so good. But in the days of Enosh, we were told, by the way, in the book of Bereshit, it says, in those days, that people began to profane the name of Hashem. What does that mean? You know, in English translations, the KJV translation, it says, in that day they began to call on the name of Hashem. It's not what it says in Hebrew. Right? It's not what it says at all. And in fact, it's just the opposite. People begin not to call on the name of Hashem, if you really want to translate it correctly. They were not calling on that name no longer. Okay? So in the days of Enosh, this one event happened. Mm-hmm. And we got to define what that is and how bad a violation of something that is. Sure. Later on, we find that the judges of that day, they're referred to as B'nai Elohim, the sons of the judges, they begin to take wives to themselves. What does that mean, they took wives to themselves? You know? It sounded like living back in the Stone Age day when the caveman goes out of the club and whacks a woman over the head and drags her away. You're going to be my wife, you know.
Right.
So what does that really mean when they were taking wives to themselves, you know?
Yeah.
Of course, there's all kind of speculation about that, but we want to actually look at it from an honest look at the text of what it's actually about, right? And then we want to discuss eventually what is, as I say often, the camel that, the straw that broke the camel's back, you know. What was the violations, the corruption that got to the point that God says this society cannot continue to exist the way it is? And he uses the word, not only is it filled with corruption and the whole earth had become corrupt, but the earth was filled with violence, you know. And it's interesting, by the way, because the Hebrew word for violence is Hamas, you know. And we think about Hamas today in the land of Israel, and look at what they're doing, the violence that they're perpetrating. You know, well, that's a pretty good name for a group of people, Hamas, violence. So we want, at least in the next couple of series of get-togethers and studies, we want to talk about deriving correct concepts of God. Is he just? And then tell me why he is just. Secondly, we want to deal with the time period prior to the flood and look at the text and see what these people were doing that was so unjust, right? And the one thing I would say that, at least from my perspective, and maybe yours too, you can add on to this, the one thing seemingly that the Creator, God, Hashem, does not like is injustice and oppression. And that seems to be the thing that causes his judgment to come upon people or nations, you know, or groups of people faster than anything. You know, it's about injustice, oppression, you know. And God reminds Israel, by the way, once he brings them out of the land, you know, in fact, in Devarim, when he rehearses the commandments and he's talking about the Sabbath day, you know, in Exodus, he says, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy, for in 6 days God created the heavens and the earth and everything that's in them. But in Devarim, he says, keep the Sabbath, right? But he also stipulates the fact, you know, for in 6 days God created the heavens and the earth. But then he adds another stipulation. Remember that you were once slaves, right? And I had compassion on you, and I showed you mercy, and I brought you out of that state of oppression and the state of injustice. And he reminds Israel, if you oppress somebody, right? He says, if you oppress the widows, if you oppress the orphans, if you oppress the strangers, I will make your wives widows, and I will make your children orphans. So it seems this idea of injustice is one thing that Hashem just does not put up with at all, and that eventually that is going to somehow cause the judgment. It does for Sodom and Gomorrah, and we'll actually get into that too. We'll talk about that because that's that span of that 2,448 years that what's going on, right? So
and you're watching, you know, think of those points that he was talking about, and also think of this. If you have injustice, and God says that, you know, for example, that Abraham will teach, you know, his children about the ways of Hashem, the ways of God, righteousness and justice or charity. The question in my mind, really listening, is if you have injustice, how do you get rid of injustice? What is the opposite of injustice? How do you achieve that